It was supposed to be an ordinary evening hike, nothing more than a peaceful walk through the woods with my girlfriend. We'd been on that trail dozens of times, always enjoying the quiet serenity of the towering trees and the rustling leaves beneath our feet. But that night, something was different. The first thing I noticed was the stillness. Usually, the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. But as we walked deeper into the woods, it was as if someone had pressed mute on nature itself. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the dirt path. I shrugged off the unease and tried to focus on the beauty of the trail, but then I heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush. It wasn't the kind of noise a squirrel or raccoon would make. It was heavier, deliberate. My girlfriend heard it too. She grabbed my arm and whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, scanning the trees with my flashlight. Nothing. "It's probably just an animal," I said, more to convince myself than her. We kept walking, but the sound followed us. Whenever we stopped, it stopped. Whenever we moved, it started again. After about 10 minutes of this eerie game of stop and go, my patience ran out. I turned around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice echoed through the woods, but there was no reply. The rustling stopped. We stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker playing some kind of twisted joke. But as I focused my light, I realized it was anything but human. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, at least 7 feet. Its body was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were thin and skeletal, like it hadn't eaten in years. What disturbed me the most were its eyes. They weren't glowing or reflecting the light like an animal's eyes would. They were just black, empty. For a moment it didn't move. It just stood there watching us. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, it darted behind another tree, moving so fast that it seemed to blur. My girlfriend let out a small scream, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her back toward the trail. We ran. I didn't care about the path or where it led. I just wanted to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. The sound of our footsteps echoed in my ears, but I could still hear something behind us, the faint rustle of leaves and the snap of twigs. It was following us. When we finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. We jumped in, slammed the doors, and locked them. I turned the headlights on, scanning the edge of the woods. For a second, I thought we were safe, but then I saw it again, standing just beyond the tree line, its black eyes fixed on us. It didn't chase us as we drove away, but the memory of that figure has stayed with me. Even now, I can't walk through the woods without looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those empty black eyes staring back at me. Camping alone in the woods was my favorite way to unwind. The isolation, the quiet, the chance to escape the chaos of everyday life, it was perfect. Or so I thought. One particular trip changed the way I view solitude forever. I had set up camp deep in the forest, far from any marked trails or other campers. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the trees. It was a peaceful evening, and after a light dinner, I sat back to stargaze. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, like the hum of distant wind. But as I strained to listen, I realized it wasn't wind, it was voices. Low, melodic, almost like a choir. They were singing, but not in any language I could understand. The harmony was beautiful yet deeply unsettling, as if the forest itself had come alive. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was hearing echoes from a distant campsite, but the nearest trailhead was miles away. Who could possibly be out here, singing in the middle of the night? Grabbing my flashlight, I stood up and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The singing stopped. The abrupt silence was worse than the voices. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and underbrush. I sat back down by the fire, every muscle in my body tense. For a while, there was nothing but the crackle of the flames. Just as I began to relax, the singing started again, louder this time, closer. It surrounded me, echoing from all directions. I jumped to my feet, clutching a hunting knife from my pack. "Who's there?" I shouted, but the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, the harmony twisting into something discordant and chaotic. My flashlight flickered, plunging me into near darkness. I stayed awake all night, sitting with my back to the fire, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The voices faded just before dawn, leaving me in an eerie silence. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I packed up my gear and left without looking back. As I retraced my steps to the car, I noticed something chilling. The trees surrounding my campsite had strange symbols carved into them. Spirally eyes, and shapes I couldn't recognize. I hadn't seen them the day before. I've camped alone many times since that night, but I'll never return to that forest. Whatever I heard, or whoever carved those symbols, wasn't meant to be found. The trail had always been a sanctuary for me, a place to escape the noise of everyday life. That evening, it seemed perfect. The crisp air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the sunset bathed the forest in a warm, golden glow. I felt a rare sense of peace as I walked deeper into the woods, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots. I had hiked this trail countless times, knew every bend and marker. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the path, I realized I had made a mistake. Somewhere, I had taken a wrong turn. At first, I wasn't concerned. I had my flashlight, a fully charged phone, and plenty of experience navigating trails. But as I wandered, the atmosphere began to shift. The air felt denser, almost oppressive, and the usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves was eerily absent. I checked my map app, but the signal was gone. The flashlight beam seemed weaker than it should have been, barely illuminating the path ahead. A chill crept up my spine, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than necessary. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a silhouette in the distance, a figure walking toward me. Relief washed over me. Another hiker. I quickened my pace, ready to ask for directions back to the main trail. But as we closed the distance, my relief turned to unease. The figure was tall, impossibly so, towering at least 7 feet. Its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, as if its joints didn't bend properly. The closer it came, the more details I could make out. Its skin was pallid and waxy, almost glowing under the dim light of the rising moon. And then I saw its eyes. Black, completely black, with no whites or pupils. They absorbed the light, like twin voids staring directly into my soul. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you know which way leads back to the main trail?" The figure paused. It didn't speak, didn't move. It only tilted its head to the side, like a predator studying its prey. The silence stretched on, oppressive and unnerving. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Hello?" I tried again, my voice breaking. Without warning, the figure turned and stepped off the trail, disappearing into the dense trees. No sound followed, no crunch of leaves or snapping of twigs. It was as if it had dissolved into the forest itself. Before I could fully process what I had seen, a whisper drifted through the air. It was faint but unmistakable, chilling me to my core. It was my name, and it wasn't spoken in my voice. Panic took over. I turned and bolted, not caring which direction I ran. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam dancing erratically as I crashed through the underbrush. Branches clawed at my face and arms, and I tripped more than once, my knees scraping against the rocky ground. The whisper came again, closer this time. It echoed in my ears, drawing me toward madness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the forest and into the gravel parking lot where my car was parked. Gasping for air, I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. Once inside, I locked the doors and turned the engine over. My headlights illuminated the empty trailhead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I drove home that night in silence, glancing at my rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see those black eyes staring back at me. I haven't gone back to that trail since. In fact, I've stopped hiking altogether. Whatever I encountered that night, it wasn't human, and I've come to believe that some places and some entities are best left undisturbed, because the black-eyed wanderer is still out there, waiting for its next victim. It was a crisp October night, and the moon hung low, casting an eerie glow over the rural outskirts of the town. Jake, a reserved young man in his early 30s, had always enjoyed solitude. After a draining week at work, he decided to escape the noise and spend the night at his family's remote cabin nestled deep in the forest. Jake cherished these retreats. The silence of the woods allowed him to think, to reflect, and to reconnect with himself. He loaded up his truck with essentials and headed out just before sunset. The drive was uneventful, the roads winding and empty, and by the time he reached the cabin, the last hues of daylight had faded into a blanket of stars. As he unpacked his things, Jake couldn't shake a strange feeling. The woods felt off. He dismissed it as fatigue and lit a fire in the stone fireplace, its crackling warmth pushing away the night's chill. Around 10 p.m., Jake stepped outside to take in the night air. The forest stretched endlessly, a sea of shadows and whispers. The tranquility was intoxicating, but then he heard it, a low, guttural howl echoing through the trees. At first, Jake thought it was a coyote or maybe a wolf, though wolves were rare in this part of the state. But the sound was unlike anything he'd ever heard before. It was deep, almost mournful, and seemed to vibrate in his chest. He stood frozen, listening as the howl grew louder, then faded into the night. Jake shook his head, chuckling nervously. "Just an animal," he muttered, retreating inside and bolting the door. But the unease lingered. As the night wore on, Jake tried to distract himself by reading, but his focus kept slipping. Every now and then, he thought he heard faint rustling outside, just beyond the glow of the cabin's porch light. Around midnight, the howling returned, closer this time. Jake's stomach tightened as the sound echoed in the stillness. He grabbed a flashlight and a hunting knife, his only defense, and stepped onto the porch. "Who's there?" he called into the void. The forest answered with silence. Then he heard it again. Not a howl, but a heavy breathing, as if something large and unseen was watching him from the darkness. Jake's flashlight beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but shadows. Suddenly, a sharp crack of a branch snapping nearby made him whip around. He saw nothing, but he felt it. A presence, malevolent and patient, lurking just out of sight. Heart pounding, Jake retreated into the cabin, locking every door and every window. He sat by the fire, clutching his knife, and listened. Hours passed, each minute stretching into eternity. Just as he began to drift off, a loud bang against the cabin wall jolted him awake. He jumped to his feet, knife in hand, as the banging came again, louder and more forceful. The howl followed, this time so close it seemed to rattle the very foundation of the cabin. Jake's mind raced. He didn't know if he was dealing with an animal or something else entirely. Gathering his courage, he flung open the door, knife raised. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but the forest was silent once more. The banging stopped, the howling ceased. And then, just beyond the tree line, Jake saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. It stood motionless, watching him. Jake's breath caught in his throat as a primal fear gripped him. The creature tilted its head, as if studying him, before emitting a guttural growl that made his blood run cold. Jake didn't wait to find out what it wanted. He slammed the door shut, barricaded it with furniture, and stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When morning finally came, Jake wasted no time packing his things and leaving the cabin behind. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching him from the road. But there was nothing. Jake never returned to the cabin, nor did he speak of that night to anyone. But sometimes, in the stillness of the evening, he swears he can hear it. That mournful howl in the distance, a chilling reminder of the presence he encountered deep in the woods. I never believed in ghosts, not really. At least, not until that one night in the Smoky Mountains. It's been almost a decade now, but the memory still haunts me. Let me tell you what happened. I was hiking solo, something I did often to clear my head. I planned a 3-day trek through a lesser-known trail. Quiet, isolated, just the way I liked it. It was early fall, and the forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. I'd packed light, just the essentials, and made camp near a shallow creek as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I fell asleep to the sound of water trickling over stones. But the second night, that's when everything changed. I'd hiked about 15 miles that day, my legs burning by the time I set up camp. I chose a spot off the trail, tucked into a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. As night fell, I sat by my small fire, staring into the flames and enjoying the quiet. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A faint light appeared through the trees, swinging gently back and forth. It was dim, like a lantern, and I assumed it was another hiker. Maybe someone had wandered off the trail and needed help. "Hello?" I called out, standing up. The light paused, then started moving toward me, slow and deliberate. "Are you lost?" I shouted again, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response, just the soft glow of the lantern getting closer. A strange chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Probably just a quiet camper, I told myself. As the light approached, I realized something was off. There was no sound, no crunching leaves, no snapping twigs, just silence and the lantern. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the light. That's when I froze. There was no one holding the lantern. It floated, suspended in the air, swaying gently as if carried by an invisible hand. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest as the lantern stopped a few yards away. Then I heard it. A voice, faint and low, like a whisper carried on the wind. "Help me," it said. The words sent a jolt of fear through me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The lantern moved closer, and the whisper grew louder, more desperate. "Help me!" I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed. Finally, something in me snapped. I turned and ran, leaving my camp behind. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at my arms and face. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail. When I finally looked back, the light was gone. The forest was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night, too terrified to close my eyes. At first light, I hiked back to my car and left the mountains behind. I later learned that the area where I'd camped was near an old logging camp that had burned down in the late 1800s. Many workers had died in the fire, trapped with no way out. Some say their spirits still wander the forest, carrying lanterns, searching for a way to safety. I don't know what I saw that night, and honestly, I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I found myself driving down a secluded road, far from the familiar buzz of the city. I had always been one for adventure, but that day, something felt different. Something felt off. I was just passing through this remote area, taking the long way home after a camping trip, when I noticed it. Tucked away in the trees, barely visible from the road, was an old, weather-beaten cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. The wooden walls were rotting, and the windows, cracked and boarded up, gave off an eerie vibe. Despite every instinct in my body warning me to keep driving, my curiosity got the better of me. I turned the car around, parked a little ways off, and started walking toward the cabin. As I got closer, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was an unnatural stillness around the place, the kind of silence that seems to swallow every sound. I could feel a faint breeze, but it didn't break the heaviness in the air. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting. I slowly pushed open the creaky door. The hinges protested, but I was too far in to back out now. Inside, dust covered everything. The floorboards groaned under my feet, and the smell of mildew and decay was overpowering. But there was something more, something unsettling. The air felt cold, unnatural for the time of year. And there, in the far corner, I saw it. A dusty old rocking chair swaying gently as though someone had just gotten up from it. I froze, staring at it, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe a draft? Maybe I was just imagining things. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. But then I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above me. I looked up toward the ceiling, my heart racing in my chest. There was no way anyone could have been up there. There was no sign of life for miles. I stood there, frozen, as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Someone, or something, was walking around upstairs. I slowly backed out of the cabin, my mind screaming for me to leave, but my legs refused to move. My breath was shallow as I turned to face the door, ready to make a run for it, when I heard it again. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Why did you come?" I didn't wait for another second. I bolted out of the cabin, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran to my car. I didn't look back once. The drive home was a blur, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, lingering just at the edge of my vision, waiting for me to look. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in the supernatural, at least not until that night. But I swear something happened to me that I can't explain, something that's haunted me ever since. Let me take you back to the beginning, and I'll tell you exactly what happened. It was late fall, and I decided to take a solo hike through the woods near my house. It wasn't the first time. I loved the solitude, the silence, just the crunch of leaves beneath my boots as I wandered deeper into the forest. The trees stood tall, their branches bare from the coming winter. The air had a crispness to it, the kind that bites at your skin but leaves you feeling alive. I was about 2 miles into the hike when I came upon a clearing. I'd been down this trail before, but I'd never noticed this spot. It was small, almost hidden, just a patch of open land surrounded by trees, with a strange calm that seemed to settle over it. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but there was something off about this place. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I brushed it off. Probably just the cold air, I thought. I stepped into the clearing, looking around. The sunlight was starting to fade, casting long shadows, and then I saw them. Eyes. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else, but no. These eyes were too large, too human-like. They were glowing, not in the way you'd expect from a reflection, but like they were their own source of light, glowing faintly yellow against the twilight. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My body felt like it was locked in place, and for a few moments I wondered if I was just seeing things, if the stress of hiking alone was playing tricks on me. But no, the eyes didn't blink, they didn't move. They just stared at me from the edge of the trees, deep in the shadows. I couldn't see anything else, just those eyes, watching. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slowly took a step back. My breath quickened, but I couldn't look away. I don't know how much time passed, maybe seconds, maybe minutes. It felt like an eternity. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like something was holding me there, keeping me in place. And then, suddenly, the eyes blinked. Not once, but twice, slowly, deliberately, like it was acknowledging me. That's when I snapped out of it. My instincts kicked in and I turned around, bolting back toward the trail, my heart racing. I didn't dare look back. I must have run for what felt like miles, but when I finally reached the familiar path that led me back to the road, I stopped. I had to catch my breath, my legs trembling beneath me. The clearing was gone, swallowed up by the trees as if it had never existed. No eyes, no strange presence, just the forest, silent and still, like it had been before. I've hiked those woods 100 times since then, but I never returned to that clearing. Every time I walk past that spot, I get this feeling, like something's watching me from just beyond the trees. And sometimes, late at night when I lie in bed, I can't help but wonder, were those eyes real? Was it a trick of the light, or was it something else? Something that doesn't belong? I still don't know the answer, but one thing is for sure. I'll never forget the eyes in the clearing, and I'll never go back. It started on an ordinary night. I was just a college student living alone in a small apartment on the edge of town. I had grown used to the quiet, the kind of peacefulness that comes with living away from the hustle and bustle. But that night, something felt different, something I couldn't put my finger on. I didn't know then that this would be the night that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I remember it clearly. It was late, and I was in the middle of finishing a project for my psychology class. The sound of my typing echoed in the room, and my eyes were glued to the screen. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, but I didn't feel like stopping. I was so absorbed in my work that I barely noticed the strange feeling creeping up my spine. Then it happened. I heard laughter. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper in the background. I paused, assuming it was some noise outside, maybe a neighbor, maybe a car passing by with the radio turned up. But then it came again, louder this time. It was a woman's laugh, high-pitched, almost mocking, and filled with an eerie sense of something wrong. The laugh was unnervingly close, but when I looked around my apartment, there was no one there. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively glanced at the front door. It was locked, of course. I told myself it was nothing. A trick of the mind, maybe? But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lingering in the shadows. I tried to ignore it and went back to my work, but the laughter wouldn't stop. It was like it was following me, echoing through the walls, getting louder each time. It was as if the sound was coming from all directions, near, far, inside, outside. The only thing I could hear now was that strange laugh. It was becoming more unsettling by the second, the way it seemed to breathe down my neck. I stood up, trying to make sense of what was happening. I checked every corner of my apartment, opened every closet, and even looked under my bed. There was no one there. I was alone. But the laughter didn't stop. It only grew more frantic, more desperate, as if it was trying to reach me, trying to get my attention. I felt my hands start to tremble. I needed to get out of there, but something told me I couldn't. The laugh, it was in my head now. It was like an echo that wouldn't fade, a ghost that refused to leave. The longer I stood there, the more I began to hear her voice. It wasn't just laughter anymore, it was her speaking to me. "Why are you so afraid?" she whispered, her voice thick with amusement. I froze. There was no one there, but I could hear her, as if she were standing right next to me. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The laughter stopped suddenly, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. It felt like the calm before a storm. Then I saw it, just out of the corner of my eye. A pale figure standing in the doorway of my bedroom, barely visible in the dim light of the hallway. She was tall, her face hidden by her dark hair, but I could feel her eyes on me. The air grew colder and the room felt heavier, as if something ancient and malevolent was standing there with me. Then, without warning, she laughed again, louder, more sinister, as if she was mocking my fear. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place. The figure stepped forward, revealing a twisted, contorted face, a grotesque, almost unnatural grin stretching across her features. Her eyes gleamed with an unsettling brightness, like she was enjoying every second of my terror. And then she spoke again, this time in a voice that made my skin crawl. "You can't escape me." I ran. I don't know how, but my body moved before my mind could catch up. I bolted out the front door, into the cold night air, not looking back. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps. But even as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right behind me, that laugh echoing in the distance. The strange thing is, I never saw her again, not in person. But every time I close my eyes, I can still hear that laugh. And every time I walk past that apartment building, I swear, I feel someone watching me. People think I'm crazy when I tell them about the laughing woman. They say it was just my imagination, that it was all in my head, but I know what I saw and I know what I heard. She's still out there somewhere, watching, waiting, and laughing. It was a warm summer evening when I first saw the old playground. It wasn't something I had planned to find, but that's how these things happen, isn't it? When you least expect it, you stumble across something that changes your life forever. This was one of those moments. I was a kid, just 10 years old, always wandering off on my own. My parents were busy, and I didn't have many friends in the neighborhood. So, I spent most of my afternoons exploring the streets, looking for something interesting, anything to break the monotony. That day, I had been walking along the edge of a small park near our house when I noticed a gate I had never seen before. It was rusty, overgrown with vines, almost hidden by the dense trees surrounding it. The gate wasn't locked, so I pushed it open, curious to see where it led. The moment I stepped through, I felt something shift. The air seemed thicker, colder. I couldn't explain it, but there was a sense of unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. But I shrugged it off. Kids are like that, brave in the face of the unknown, especially when the unknown is an old abandoned playground. The playground looked like something out of a different era. The swings hung limply, their chains rusted and tangled with ivy. The merry-go-round, once bright and colorful, was now faded and chipped, the paint long gone. The slide, which should have been shining in the sun, was darkened by years of neglect. But it was eerily quiet, like no one had been there in years. No laughter, no running feet, just silence. I didn't feel like running off, though. There was something about the place that made me want to explore more. Maybe it was the intrigue of the place, or maybe it was the strange pull I felt toward it. I wandered over to the swings, pushing one with my hand. It creaked loudly, almost painfully, as if it had been waiting to be moved. I tried to shake off the discomfort I felt and turned to leave, but that's when I heard it. A soft whisper, almost like a giggle. I froze. I looked around, expecting to see other kids hiding behind the structures, waiting to jump out at me, but there was no one. The playground was as deserted as before. I took a step back, my heart pounding now. I heard the whisper again, closer this time. It wasn't a giggle anymore, but more of a low, drawn-out sigh. The sound was coming from the slide. I hesitated. Every part of me told me to leave, but my feet seemed rooted to the ground. I looked at the slide almost as if it were calling to me. Slowly, I walked over. The moment I reached the base of the slide, the whispers stopped, replaced by an overwhelming silence. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and that's when I saw it. At the top of the slide, sitting in the shadows, was a figure. It was small, no bigger than a child, but the way it sat there, hunched over, its face obscured by a shadow, made it look wrong. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there as if waiting for me. I wanted to scream, to run away, but I couldn't. I stood there, my body frozen, eyes locked on the figure. I don't know how long I stared at it, but then it shifted. Just a little at first, and then it slowly turned its head to look at me. Its eyes. They weren't like any eyes I had ever seen before. They were pitch black, hollow, with no whites, no pupils, just dark voids that seemed to swallow everything around them. I couldn't look away, couldn't tear myself from those empty eyes. Then it smiled. A wide, unnatural smile that stretched too far, exposing too many teeth. The figure didn't move from the slide, but I could feel its gaze following me as I slowly backed away. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the playground, as if something had crashed to the ground. I snapped out of my trance and bolted. I didn't care what was behind me. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could through the gate, and didn't stop until I was back in my own neighborhood, breathless and terrified. I never told anyone about what happened that day. Who would believe me? It was just a playground, right? But even now, years later, I can still hear that whisper, feel those eyes on me, and I wonder, what was waiting for me in that playground? Why did it want me to stay? To this day, I never pass by that gate. I don't even go near the park anymore. And whenever I see a playground, I can't help but think about the one that was silent, the one that hid something far worse than just rusted swings and broken slides. It was a night like any other when I decided to take my usual evening drive through the back roads. I often drove this route to clear my mind after long shifts at work. The fog had rolled in quickly, thicker than usual, and by the time I reached the forested area, visibility was down to almost nothing. I should have turned around, but something about the eeriness of it called to me. The road wound through the woods, tall trees standing on either side like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. My headlights barely pierced the fog, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. I could feel the temperature drop as the mist grew denser, the air becoming heavy and cold. As I drove deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. There was no sound. Normally, you'd hear the hum of insects or the rustling of leaves in the breeze, but now it was deathly quiet. Not a single animal sound, nothing. It was as if the world had gone completely still. Then I saw it. A figure standing just off the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the fog, maybe a tree or a shadow. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A tall man, completely still, with his back to me. His clothes were soaked, his hair hanging in wet strands around his face, and he didn't move an inch. I slowed down, instinctively glancing away, unsure of what to do. Something about his stillness unsettled me. I looked back at the road, then at the figure again. He was still there, but now he had turned his head just slightly, as if aware I was looking at him. I couldn't see his face through the fog, but I felt the weight of his gaze, like he was watching me with a predatory intensity. My foot hovered over the brake, but I decided to keep going. There was something wrong, something deeply off about the situation. I wasn't sure why, but every fiber of my being screamed for me to leave. As I passed, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me drive away. What I saw instead froze me. Figure had turned around completely, his face now visible in the mirror, except it wasn't a face at all. It was a blank, featureless mask of pale skin stretched tightly over a grotesque skeletal frame. The eyes were black voids, and the mouth, if it could be called that, was twisted in an unnatural grin that made my stomach turn. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, speeding through the fog, not daring to look back. My heart raced, and every turn felt like I was being chased. I don't know how long I drove like that, but eventually the fog began to thin, and the eerie feeling slowly dissipated. I didn't stop until I reached home. The next day, I drove the same route, hoping to find some explanation. Maybe a person stranded, maybe some logical reason behind what happened. But when I passed that stretch of road, there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no trace of the figure. Just the fog that still seemed to linger at the edge of the trees. I haven't driven that road at night since. Every time I pass through the fog now, I feel a chill, as if the thing that followed me that night is still out there, waiting for the next time I venture too deep into the mist.